A man stands on a gallows in Port Royal, Jamaica. The rope tightens around his neck. Below him, a crowd has gathered. Merchants, sailors, women holding children on their hips. They've come to watch him die. His name is John Rackham. History will remember him as Calico Jack, a pirate who wore bright patterned cloth and flew a flag with a skull and crossed swords. But right now, in November 1720 AD, he's just a man about to hang. The executioner asks if he has any last words. Rackham looks out at the harbour. Ships bob in the blue water, their sails furled, their holds full of sugar and rum. He says nothing. What makes a person become a pirate? What turns someone from a law-abiding sailor into an outlaw of the sea? For 300 years, the Caribbean was home to thousands of men and women who chose violence and freedom over safety and order. They built floating democracies. They challenged empires. They died young, and they died badly. This is the story of Caribbean piracy, not the Hollywood version, but the real one. The story of how poverty, war, and greed created the Golden Age of Piracy. The story of what it actually meant to sail under the black flag. The rope waits, the crowd waits. But before we watch Rackham fall, we need to understand how he got here. Before there were pirates, there was an ocean. The Caribbean Sea stretches across more than 1 million square miles. It touches the coasts of more than 30 islands and 3 continents. Its waters are warm, its currents predictable. For thousands of years, people lived on its islands, farming, fishing, building societies that rose and fell with the seasons. The Taino people inhabited many of the larger Caribbean islands. They lived on Hispaniola, Cuba, Jamaica, and Puerto Rico. They farmed cassava and sweet potatoes. They fished in wooden canoes carved from single tree trunks. They had art, religion, complex social structures. Trade networks connected distant islands. Taino merchants traveled between islands in large canoes that could hold up to 50 people. They traded shells, pottery, tobacco, and gold ornaments. They had a word for their islands: Borinquen, Quisqueya, Cuba. They had no word for invasion. Then, in 1492 AD, Christopher Columbus arrived. Columbus wasn't looking for the Caribbean. He was trying to reach Asia by sailing west from Spain. He believed the world was smaller than it actually was. He thought Japan lay just a few thousand miles west of Europe. Instead, he found islands. On October 12, 1492 AD, Columbus's expedition landed on an island in what we now call the Bahamas. The Taino people who lived there called it Guanahani. Columbus renamed it San Salvador. The Taino people who came to greet Columbus's ships were curious. They'd never seen European ships before. They'd never seen white-skinned men. They brought gifts: parrots, cotton thread, spears. Columbus wrote in his journal that the Taino would make good servants. He noted they wore small gold ornaments. He asked where the gold came from. This question would shape the next century. Columbus explored the Caribbean for 3 months. He visited Cuba and Hispaniola. He established a small settlement on Hispaniola, La Navidad, he called it. He left 39 men there with instructions to find gold. Then he sailed back to Spain. Columbus brought with him parrots, gold ornaments, samples of strange plants, and several Taino captives. He told King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella that he'd found a route to Asia. He was wrong, but the Spanish monarchs didn't know that yet. What they did know was that Columbus had found land that could be claimed, land that contained gold. Ferdinand and Isabella funded a second, larger expedition. In 1493 AD, Columbus returned to the Caribbean with 17 ships and more than 1,000 men. This wasn't an exploration, it was a colonization. When Columbus returned to La Navidad, he found it destroyed. The Taino had killed all 39 Spaniards. Columbus learned that his men had been kidnapping Taino women and stealing gold. The Taino had fought back. Columbus established a new settlement, La Isabela. He began organizing the island. He imposed a tribute system. Every Taino person over the age of 14 was required to bring a certain amount of gold to the Spanish every 3 months. Those who complied received a copper token to wear around their necks. Those who failed to bring enough gold were punished. The punishments were brutal. Hands were cut off. People were beaten. Some were killed. But Hispaniola didn't have much gold. The gold ornaments the Taino wore came from small deposits in rivers. There were no rich mines. The Spanish demanded more gold than existed. Taino people fled into the mountains. Some resisted. A cacique, a Taino chief, named Caonabo, led a rebellion against the Spanish. Columbus captured him through treachery and sent him to Spain in chains. Caonabo died during the voyage. The Taino population began to collapse. Violence killed thousands. European diseases killed far more. The Taino had no immunity to smallpox, measles, typhus, or influenza. When Spanish sailors brought these diseases to the Caribbean, they spread rapidly. Entire villages were wiped out. Families disappeared. By 1508 AD, just 16 years after Columbus's first voyage, the Taino population of Hispaniola had fallen from several hundred thousand to around 60,000. By 1531 AD, fewer than 600 remained. This pattern repeated across the Caribbean. The Spanish conquered Cuba in 1511 AD. A conquistador named Diego Velázquez led the invasion. The Cuban Taino resisted under a cacique named Hattuey. Hattuey had fled from Hispaniola and warned the Cuban Taino about the Spanish. According to Bartolomé de las Casas, a Spanish priest who documented these events, Hattuey showed his people a basket of gold and said this was the god the Spanish worshipped. He suggested they throw the gold into the sea so the Spanish would have no reason to come. But the Spanish came anyway. Hattuey was captured and sentenced to be burned at the stake. Before his execution, a priest offered him the chance to convert to Christianity. If he converted, the priest said, he would go to heaven. Hattuey asked if Christians went to heaven. The priest said yes. Hattuey refused to convert. He said he didn't want to go to a place where he might encounter more Spanish people. Jamaica fell to the Spanish in 1509 AD, Puerto Rico in 1508 AD. Each island saw the same devastation. The Spanish needed labor. With the indigenous population dying, they looked elsewhere. In 1501 AD, the Spanish crown authorized the importation of enslaved Africans to the Caribbean. This was the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade to the Americas. African slaves were brought to work in gold mines and on plantations. The first crops were cassava and sugarcane. Sugar would eventually become the Caribbean's most profitable export. But the real wealth wasn't in the Caribbean islands themselves. In 1519 AD, Hernán Cortés landed on the coast of Mexico. He encountered the Aztec Empire, a powerful civilization that controlled much of central Mexico. The Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, was one of the largest cities in the world. It had temples, palaces, floating gardens. It also had gold. Cortés allied with indigenous groups who resented Aztec rule. He besieged Tenochtitlan. In 1521 AD, the city fell. The Spanish began extracting wealth from Mexico on a scale that dwarfed anything they'd found in the Caribbean. In 1532 AD, Francisco Pizarro conquered the Inca Empire in Peru. The Inca capital, Cusco, was filled with gold, so much gold that rooms were lined with it. Pizarro melted it down and shipped it to Spain. But the most valuable discovery came slightly later. In 1545 AD, Spanish prospectors found a mountain of silver in what is now Bolivia. Cerro Rico, the rich mountain, contained the largest silver deposit ever discovered. Over the next 3 centuries, this single mountain would produce roughly half of the world's silver. The Spanish established a city at the base of the mountain, Potosi. By 1650 AD, Potosi was one of the largest cities in the world, larger than London or Paris. But it was a brutal place. Indigenous people were forced to work in the mines under a system called the mita. Workers were sent into tunnels that went deep into the mountain. The air was thin. Potosi sits at more than 13,000 feet above sea level. Accidents were common. Cave-ins killed hundreds. Mercury poisoning killed even more. The Spanish used mercury to extract silver from ore. Workers handled mercury with their bare hands. They breathed mercury vapor in poorly ventilated spaces. Mercury poisoning causes tremors, memory loss, kidney failure. Millions died in the mines of Potosi. But the silver flowed out. Every year, convoys of mules carried silver from Potosi across the Andes to the Pacific coast. From there, it was loaded onto ships bound for Panama. In Panama, the silver was unloaded and carried by mule train across the isthmus to the Caribbean coast. Then it was loaded onto ships again. The Caribbean became a highway for Spanish treasure. Spanish treasure fleets, called flotas, sailed from ports like Cartagena, Portobello, and Veracruz to Havana, Cuba. Havana was the assembly point. Ships from all over the Spanish Empire gathered there. Twice a year, the combined fleet would sail from Havana to Spain. The fleets were massive. A typical floater might include 40 or 50 merchant ships, protected by a dozen armed galleons. The merchant ships carried silver, gold, pearls, emeralds, cochineal dye, indigo, hides, sugar, and tobacco. The total value of a single fleet's cargo could reach 10 million pesos, an almost incomprehensible sum. To put that in perspective, a skilled craftsman in Spain might earn 50 pesos per year. A single treasure fleet carried the equivalent of 200,000 years of a craftsman's wages. Other European powers noticed. France, England, and the Netherlands watched Spain grow wealthy from American silver. They wanted their share. But Spain claimed the entire region under papal authority. In 1493 AD, Pope Alexander VI issued a papal bull, a formal decree, dividing the newly discovered lands between Spain and Portugal. A line was drawn on a map. Everything west of the line belonged to Spain. Everything east belonged to Portugal. This division was later formalized in the Treaty of Tordesillas. Catholic France grudgingly accepted Spanish dominance, but Protestant England and the Netherlands rejected papal authority entirely. They argued that the Pope had no right to divide the world. They began sending their own ships to the Americas. At first, these were trading expeditions. English and Dutch merchants hoped to trade with Spanish colonies, but Spanish law forbade trade with foreigners. Spanish colonial governors turned away English and Dutch ships. So the English and Dutch turned to smuggling. They traded illegally with Spanish colonists who were willing to ignore royal decrees. Many Spanish colonists were willing. Spain maintained strict control over trade with its colonies. Spanish merchants charged high prices for European goods. English and Dutch smugglers offered better deals. But smuggling sometimes turned into raiding. In the 1560s AD, an English merchant named John Hawkins began conducting what he called trading voyages. Hawkins sailed to West Africa. There he captured enslaved people, sometimes by attacking Portuguese slave ships, sometimes by raiding African villages. He then sailed to the Caribbean and sold the enslaved Africans to Spanish colonists. This was illegal under Spanish law. Spain had a monopoly on the slave trade to its colonies, but Hawkins didn't care about Spanish law. On his first voyage, in 1562 AD, Hawkins made a large profit. He made 2 more voyages in 1564 AD and 1567 AD. On the third voyage, disaster struck. Hawkins's fleet was caught in a hurricane. Damaged and leaking, his ships limped into the Mexican port of San Juan de Ulua. Hawkins hoped to make repairs. But the next day, a Spanish fleet arrived. The Spanish viceroy ordered an attack. Hawkins's fleet was almost destroyed. Only 2 of his ships escaped. One of those ships was commanded by Hawkins's cousin, Francis Drake. Drake never forgave the Spanish for the attack at San Juan de Ulua. He spent the rest of his life seeking revenge. Drake became the most successful English privateer of the 16th century. He raided Spanish settlements across the Caribbean and Central America. He captured Spanish treasure ships. He sailed around the world, only the second expedition to do so. In 1572 AD, Drake led a daring raid on Nombre de Dios, a Spanish port on the Caribbean coast of Panama. Nombre de Dios was where silver from Peru was stored before being loaded onto ships. Drake attacked the town with fewer than 70 men. The raid didn't go as planned. Drake was wounded during the attack. His men had to retreat without capturing the silver. But Drake didn't give up. He built a small fort on the coast and waited. He made alliances with Cimarrones, escaped African slaves who lived in the jungle. The Cimarrones hated the Spanish as much as Drake did. With Cimarron guides, Drake marched across the Isthmus of Panama. He climbed a tree on a mountain ridge. For the first time, an Englishman saw the Pacific Ocean from the Americas. Drake vowed he would one day sail on that ocean. But first, he had silver to steal. Drake and his allies ambushed a Spanish mule train carrying silver from Panama City to Nombre de Dios. The ambush was successful. Drake captured 30 tons of silver. It was too much to carry. Drake and his men buried most of it in the jungle. They carried as much as they could back to their ships. They sailed back to England. Drake divided the silver among his crew. Every man became wealthy. When Drake arrived in England, Queen Elizabeth I received him warmly. She didn't care that Drake had attacked Spanish territory without royal authorization. She cared that he'd brought back Spanish silver. The Spanish ambassador protested. He called Drake a pirate. He demanded Drake be hanged. Elizabeth ignored the protests. The line between privateering and piracy was thin. Privateers carried letters of marque, legal documents that authorized them to attack enemy ships during wartime. Drake didn't always bother with letters of marque. He was acting in his own interest, but his raids weakened Spain. England benefited. So Elizabeth looked the other way. By the late 1500s AD, the Caribbean had become a battleground. Spain controlled the largest islands and the richest ports, but English, French, and Dutch raiders attacked Spanish shipping and settlements. Spain tried to defend its empire. It built forts in key ports. It sent warships to patrol Caribbean waters. It organized treasure fleets with armed escorts. But Spain was overstretched. It was fighting wars in Europe. It was trying to suppress rebellions in the Netherlands. It couldn't protect every ship and every settlement in the Americas. And so the raids continued. In 1586 AD, Drake led a massive raid on Spanish America. He commanded a fleet of more than 20 ships and 2,000 men. He attacked Santo Domingo, the capital of Hispaniola. He held the city for ransom. The Spanish paid. Drake then attacked Cartagena, one of the most important Spanish ports in South America. He captured the city and held it for ransom. Again, the Spanish paid. Drake's raids humiliated Spain. They showed that Spanish America was vulnerable. They proved that English raiders could strike anywhere, even in the heart of the Spanish Empire. Spain decided enough was enough. In 1588 AD, King Philip II of Spain assembled an armada, a massive fleet, to invade England. The Spanish Armada consisted of more than 130 ships. It was the largest naval expedition in history up to that point. The plan was to sail to the Netherlands, pick up Spanish troops stationed there, and invade England. The Armada never made it. English ships harassed the Spanish fleet as it sailed up the English Channel. Storms battered the Armada. More than half the ships were lost. The defeat of the Spanish Armada marked a turning point. Spain was no longer invincible. England, France, and the Netherlands grew bolder. They began establishing their own colonies in the Caribbean. In 1624 AD, the English established a settlement on St. Kitts. The French did the same. English and French colonists agreed to share the island and jointly defend it against Spanish attacks. In 1625 AD, the English captured Barbados. The island was uninhabited. The indigenous population had died or fled decades earlier. English settlers began growing tobacco and cotton. Later, they switched to sugar. The Dutch captured Curaçao in 1634 AD. The French took Guadeloupe and Martinique in 1635 AD. These early colonies were small and vulnerable. Spain still controlled the Caribbean's most valuable islands, but the balance of power was shifting. Life in these early Caribbean colonies was brutal. Most settlers were indentured servants. They'd signed contracts agreeing to work for a master for a set number of years, usually 4 to 7, in exchange for passage to the Americas. The work was backbreaking. Servants cleared land, planted crops, built houses. They worked from sunrise to sunset. Masters could beat them for disobedience. Disease killed many. Yellow fever, malaria, and dysentery were common. Roughly half of all indentured servants died before completing their terms of service. Those who survived often found themselves landless and poor. They'd been promised land at the end of their service, but the best land was already claimed by wealthy planters. Former servants received small plots of marginal land, rocky, infertile, far from ports. Many couldn't make a living. Some returned to England, some became sailors, some turned to crime, and some became buccaneers. The word buccaneer comes from bucan, a Taino word for a wooden frame used to smoke meat. In the early 1600s AD, the northern and western coasts of Hispaniola were wild places. Spanish settlers lived mostly in the south and east, in cities like Santo Domingo. The rest of the island was left largely ungoverned. Into this vacuum came the buccaneers. They were European castaways, deserters, escaped servants, French, English, Dutch, men who'd fled the plantations or been marooned by ship captains, men with nothing to lose. They lived in crude camps along the coast. They hunted wild cattle and pigs. The cattle and pigs had been introduced by the Spanish decades earlier and then left to multiply. By the 1620s AD, Hispaniola's wilderness was full of them. The buccaneers killed the animals, skinned them, and smoked the meat on bucans. The smoked meat was valuable. Ships sailing through the Caribbean needed provisions. Fresh meat spoiled quickly in the tropical heat. Smoked meat lasted months. Buccaneers traded their meat and hides to passing ships. In exchange, they got gunpowder, rum, tobacco, weapons, and cloth. Buccaneer life was harsh. Men lived in groups of 2 or 3, forming partnerships called matelotage. Matelots shared everything: food, shelter, possessions. If one man died, the other inherited his belongings. Buccaneers wore clothes stained with blood and grease. They rarely bathed. They smelled of smoke and sweat. They slept in hammocks strung between trees or in crude shelters made of palm fronds. They had no formal laws, no government, no church. Alexandre Exquemelin, a buccaneer who later wrote a book about his experiences, described them as living like savages, but he also noted they were fiercely independent. They answered to no master. They lived by their own rules. The Spanish authorities hated the buccaneers. They saw them as trespassers on Spanish territory. They also saw them as heretics. Most buccaneers were Protestant, French Huguenots or English Anglicans. Spain was fervently Catholic. In the 1630s AD, Spanish soldiers began hunting down buccaneer camps. They burned shelters. They killed buccaneers on sight. They also killed the cattle and pigs to deprive the hunters of their prey. This strategy backfired. Without animals to hunt, the buccaneers couldn't survive on Hispaniola, but instead of leaving, they became more violent. Many moved to Tortuga, a small rocky island off the northwest coast of Hispaniola. Tortuga means turtle in Spanish. The island was shaped like a turtle's shell. It was about 23 miles long and 4 miles wide. Its terrain was mountainous and difficult to farm, but it had excellent harbors. Tortuga became a refuge for anyone who wanted to operate outside Spanish law. The buccaneers who settled on Tortuga began raiding Spanish ships. They used small, fast boats, canoes and sloops. They attacked at dawn or dusk when visibility was low. They targeted coastal traders and fishing vessels. At first, these weren't sophisticated operations. Buccaneer crews were small, 10, 20, sometimes 30 men. They attacked poorly defended ships. They stole food, tools, weapons, cloth. But gradually, they became bolder. One of the earliest buccaneer legends involves a Frenchman named Pierre le Grand. The story may be exaggerated, but it captures the audacity of the early buccaneers. According to the tale, Legrand commanded a single small boat with just 28 men. They'd been at sea for weeks without finding prey. Their supplies were running low. Then they spotted a large Spanish galleon. Legrand's men wanted to flee. The galleon was far more powerful than their tiny boat, but Legrand ordered them to attack. To ensure his men wouldn't change their minds, Legrand reportedly scuttled his own boat. He bored holes in the hull. The boat began to sink. Now the buccaneers had no choice. They had to capture the galleon or drown. Legrand approached the galleon at night. The Spanish crew didn't realize the small boat was a threat. By the time they understood what was happening, Legrand's men were boarding. The buccaneers fought their way onto the deck. They were outnumbered, but they fought with desperate ferocity. The Spanish captain was killed in the fighting. The Spanish crew surrendered. Inside the galleon's hold, Legrand found treasure: barrels of silver coins, bales of silk and fine cloth, crates of indigo dye. Legrand sailed the captured galleon to France. He divided the loot among his crew. Every man became wealthy. Legrand himself retired. He was in his 20s. He'd made enough money in one raid to live comfortably for the rest of his life. Stories like this spread quickly. Young men across Europe heard about Pierre Legrand. They heard that a single lucky raid could make you rich. They heard that the Caribbean was a place where a poor man could become wealthy. Many were wrong. Most buccaneers died young, killed in battle or by disease. Most never captured a Spanish galleon full of treasure. But enough succeeded to keep the dream alive. By the 1640s AD, Tortuga had grown into a small settlement. French colonists arrived, bringing with them rudimentary governance. A French governor was appointed. A fort was built on a rocky hill overlooking the harbor. Tortuga became a haven. Merchants came to buy stolen goods. Sailors came to find work on buccaneer ships. Taverns opened. Brothels operated openly. Women lived on Tortuga, though they were far outnumbered by men. Some were prostitutes. Some were wives or partners of buccaneers. Some ran taverns or worked as farmers. In 1665 AD, the French government sent nearly 2,000 women to the Caribbean, including Tortuga, to address the gender imbalance in the colonies. Most of these women were prostitutes, criminals, or orphans. They'd been given a choice: go to the Caribbean or go to prison. Many chose the Caribbean. Life on Tortuga was violent and unpredictable. Fights broke out in taverns. Men gambled away their plunder. Drunkenness was common. But Tortuga also had a rough form of order. Buccaneers operated under codes. These codes weren't written down in the early days. They were oral agreements, passed from crew to crew. Alexandre Exquemelin later documented some of these rules. Exquemelin was a Dutchman who came to the Caribbean as an indentured servant in 1666 AD. He served his term working on a Tortuga plantation. After gaining his freedom, he became a surgeon on buccaneer ships. Exquemelin spent several years with the buccaneers. He participated in raids. He treated wounded men. He witnessed brutality and camaraderie. In 1678 AD, he published a book, The Buccaneers of America. The book was an immediate bestseller. It was translated into multiple languages. It shaped European perceptions of Caribbean piracy for centuries. Exquemelin described how buccaneers divided plunder. Before a voyage, the crew would agree on shares. The captain received 1.5 or 2 shares. Ordinary sailors received 1 share each. The difference wasn't enormous. On a naval ship or a merchant vessel, the captain might earn 50 times what an ordinary sailor earned. On a buccaneer ship, the captain earned twice as much. This relative equality was part of buccaneer culture. Buccaneers also had a system for compensating injuries. If a man lost his right arm in battle, he received 600 pieces of 8. A left arm was worth 500. A right leg was worth 500. A left leg, 400. An eye or a finger was worth 100. These payments came out of the common fund before treasure was divided. A buccaneer who lost a leg in battle wouldn't be left destitute. He'd receive compensation from his crewmates. This was a form of insurance. It encouraged men to fight bravely. It also ensured that wounded men wouldn't become beggars. Buccaneer ships were, in a strange way, democratic. Captains were elected by the crew. If the crew lost confidence in a captain, they could vote him out. Major decisions were often made by majority vote. Where should we sail? The crew voted. Which ship should we attack? The crew voted. Should we accept a pardon and retire? The crew voted. This was radically different from Royal Navy ships. On a naval vessel, the captain's word was absolute law. Sailors who questioned orders could be flogged or hanged. Buccaneer democracy had limits. During battle, the captain's authority was absolute. Men who disobeyed orders during a fight could be shot on the spot. And Buccaneer egalitarianism didn't extend to their victims. Exquemelin documented Buccaneer brutality. Spanish prisoners were tortured to reveal where they'd hidden valuables. A common method was wooding, tying a rope around a man's head and twisting it with a stick until the skull cracked. Women were assaulted. Towns were burned. Buccaneers weren't noble rebels. They were violent men in a violent world. But they'd created a society that, within its own ranks, offered something different from the hierarchies they'd escaped. By the 1650s AD, buccaneering had evolved. Crews grew larger, ships became more powerful, raids became more ambitious. Buccaneers began attacking not just ships, but towns. And into this world stepped a Welsh privateer who would become the most famous buccaneer of all. His name was Henry Morgan. In 1668 AD, a Welsh buccaneer named Henry Morgan led a raid on the Spanish town of Portobello on the Caribbean coast of Panama. Portobello was one of the most important ports in the Spanish Empire. Its name meant beautiful port in Spanish, and it lived up to that name, a deep, sheltered harbour surrounded by green hills. But Portobello's beauty wasn't what mattered to Spain. What mattered was its location. Portobello was where treasure from Peru was loaded onto ships bound for Spain. Silver from Potosi made the long journey across the Andes, down to the Pacific coast, then by ship to Panama City. From Panama City, mule trains carried it across the isthmus to Portobello. There, it waited in warehouses for the treasure fleet. The Spanish knew Portobello was valuable. They'd fortified it heavily. 3 stone forts guarded the harbour. Castillo Santiago stood at the harbour entrance. Castillo San Jeronimo guarded the town itself. Castillo San Felipe de Sotomayor overlooked the bay. These weren't simple wooden palisades. They were massive stone fortifications with thick walls, dozens of cannons, and garrisons of soldiers. Morgan attacked anyway. Henry Morgan was born in Wales, probably in the 1630s. AD, little is known about his early life. He may have been born into a farming family. He may have had some education. He was literate, unusual for someone of his probable background. He came to the Caribbean sometime in the 1650s, AD. He may have been a soldier in Oliver Cromwell's army. In 1655 AD, Cromwell launched an expedition to capture Spanish territory in the Caribbean. The expedition failed to capture its primary target, Santo Domingo, but it succeeded in capturing Jamaica. Jamaica became an English colony. Morgan may have been part of the force that captured Jamaica, or he may have arrived later as a settler. What's certain is that by the 1660s AD, Morgan was commanding buccaneer ships operating out of Jamaica. Morgan wasn't just a sailor. He was intelligent, charismatic, and strategic. He understood how to organize large groups of buccaneers, men who were notoriously difficult to command. He also understood politics. Jamaica's governor was Thomas Modiford, a wealthy planter who'd served as governor of Barbados before being appointed to Jamaica. Modiford saw buccaneers as useful. England and Spain were rivals. They weren't officially at war, but they weren't at peace either. Spanish authorities in the Caribbean attacked English settlements. English authorities retaliated. Buccaneers could harass Spanish shipping and settlements without requiring England to officially declare war. Modiford gave Morgan a commission, a legal document that authorized him to attack Spanish targets. This made Morgan a privateer, not a pirate. The line was thin. In 1668 AD, Morgan assembled a fleet to attack Portobello. He had 9 ships. Around 400 buccaneers volunteered for the expedition. Morgan knew he couldn't attack Portobello by sea. The harbour forts would destroy his ships before they could land troops. So he used deception. Morgan sailed past Portobello and anchored his ships several miles west of the town. He and his men disembarked and marched overland through the jungle. They approached Portobello from the land side, where the defences were weaker. Morgan attacked at night on July 11, 1668 AD. The first target was Castillo Santiago. Morgan's men approached silently. They used ladders to scale the walls. The Spanish garrison was caught completely by surprise. Fighting broke out on the ramparts. Confused, desperate combat in the dark. Men swung cutlasses blindly. Muskets fired, their flashes briefly illuminating the chaos. Within an hour, Castillo Santiago had fallen. Morgan's men turned the fort's cannons on the town. The next target was Castillo San Jeronimo. This fort was better prepared. The garrison had heard the fighting at Castillo Santiago. They were ready. Morgan tried a direct assault. His men charged the walls with ladders. Spanish soldiers fired down from the ramparts. Buccaneers fell. The assault failed. Morgan regrouped and tried again. Again, his men were repelled. Then Morgan did something that would haunt his reputation for centuries. He took hostages from the town, monks, nuns, and other civilians. He forced them to carry ladders to the fort's walls. Spanish soldiers inside the fort faced an impossible choice. Fire on their own people and let the buccaneers advance, or hold their fire and watch the buccaneers breach the walls. Some soldiers refused to shoot, others hesitated. That hesitation cost them the fort. Morgan's men breached the walls and poured into Castillo San Jeronimo. The fighting was brutal. Spanish soldiers fought room to room. The fort's commander, a man named Don Pedro de la Vega, refused to surrender even as his men fell around him. He was killed fighting. With 2 of the 3 forts captured, the third, Castillo San Felipe, surrendered without a fight. Morgan now controlled Portobello. For the next 2 weeks, the buccaneers occupied the town. They looted homes and warehouses. They broke into churches and stole gold and silver altar pieces. They took prisoners, wealthy merchants and officials, and held them for ransom. Morgan sent a message to the Spanish governor in Panama City. Pay a ransom of 100,000 pesos, or Portobello would be burned to the ground. The Spanish governor assembled a force to retake the town, but before he could march, news arrived of Morgan's threat. The governor paid. He sent 100,000 pesos in silver to Portobello. Morgan accepted the ransom and sailed away. Back in Jamaica, Morgan divided the loot among his crew. Each buccaneer received about 250 pieces of 8, more than a year's wages for a skilled craftsman. Morgan himself became wealthy. He also became famous. News of the raid spread across the Caribbean and back to Europe. Spain was humiliated. One of its most important ports had been captured by a few hundred buccaneers. But Morgan wasn't finished. Over the next 2 years, he led several more raids. He attacked Maracaibo, a wealthy city on the coast of Venezuela. He captured Spanish ships. He accumulated more wealth and more fame. Then, in 1670 AD, Morgan set his sights on the biggest prize of all, Panama City. Panama City was the capital of Spanish Panama. It sat on the Pacific coast, connected to the Caribbean by the narrow isthmus. It was one of the richest cities in the Spanish Empire. Taking Panama City would require a massive effort. In December 1670 AD, Morgan assembled the largest buccaneer force ever gathered, 36 ships, nearly 2,000 men. The fleet included buccaneers of all nationalities, English, French, Dutch. Some were former sailors, some were escaped servants, some were former slaves. Morgan's plan was audacious. His ships would remain on the Caribbean side of the isthmus. He and his men would march across the jungle to Panama City. It was a dangerous gamble. The jungle was thick and difficult to traverse. Rivers had to be crossed. The Spanish could easily ambush them along the way. But Morgan had advantages. He had guides, indigenous people, and escaped slaves who knew the terrain. He had experienced soldiers, and he had the element of surprise. The Spanish didn't believe anyone would be foolish enough to march across the isthmus with such a large force. Morgan captured Portobello again, this time without resistance. The fort garrisons had been reduced. Spain was confident no one would attack the same place twice. From Portobello, Morgan began the march. The march took 9 days. It was one of the most grueling experiences of the buccaneers' lives. They hacked through dense jungle. They waded through rivers infested with crocodiles. They fought off Spanish ambushes. Food ran out. Morgan had expected to forage along the way, but the Spanish had evacuated villages and destroyed crops to deny the buccaneers supplies. The buccaneers were starving. According to Exquemelin, some men ate their leather satchels. They boiled the leather to make it soft, then chewed it to get some nutrition. On January 18th, 1671 AD, the buccaneers emerged from the jungle. Before them lay the plains outside Panama City. And beyond that, for the first time, many of them saw the Pacific Ocean. Juan Perez de Guzman, the Spanish governor of Panama, had known Morgan was coming. Reports had reached him of the buccaneer fleet gathering at Portobello. He'd had time to prepare a defense. Guzman assembled a force of approximately 1,200 men. These weren't professional soldiers. Most were militia, townspeople pressed into service. Panama City had no standing army. Guzman also had a secret weapon. He'd gathered a herd of about 2,000 cattle. His plan was to stampede the cattle into the buccaneer ranks during the battle. The idea was that the charging animals would break Morgan's formation. It was clever in theory. On the morning of January 18th, the two forces met on the plains outside Panama City. Morgan's buccaneers were exhausted, hungry, and thirsty. They'd marched for 9 days through hostile terrain. Many were wounded from ambushes along the way. But they were also desperate. They'd come too far to turn back. Panama City represented their reward: wealth, food, rest. Guzman's militia formed up on the plains, infantry in the center, cavalry on the flanks. The cattle herd waited behind the lines. Morgan assessed the situation. He divided his force into 3 groups. The main body would advance directly toward the Spanish center. 2 smaller groups would move around the flanks. The battle began with gunfire. Both sides fired muskets at long range. Smoke filled the air. Men fell. Then Guzman ordered the cattle stampede. Vaqueros, Spanish cowboys, drove the herd toward the buccaneer lines, 2,000 cattle thundering across the plain. But the plan failed. The buccaneers simply stepped aside. They let the cattle run past. Some buccaneers even fired at the herd, scattering the animals. The Spanish cavalry charged. This was more dangerous. Mounted soldiers could break through infantry lines, but the buccaneers were experienced fighters. They formed defensive squares, tight formations that presented a wall of muskets and pikes to the charging cavalry. The Spanish horsemen couldn't break through. Horses balked at charging into massed infantry. Riders were shot from their saddles. The cavalry charge faltered. Now Morgan's buccaneers advanced. They moved forward steadily, firing as they went. The Spanish militia, mostly untrained civilians, began to waver. When the buccaneers closed to within 100 yards, they charged. The Spanish line broke. Men fled toward Panama City. The buccaneers pursued, cutting down anyone who couldn't run fast enough. Within 2 hours, the battle was over. Governor Guzman fled into the jungle. Morgan's buccaneers entered Panama City. What happened next is one of the most controversial episodes in Caribbean history. Panama City burned. According to Spanish accounts, Morgan's buccaneers set the fire deliberately. They torched buildings, destroyed churches, killed civilians. According to Morgan's own account, the Spanish set the fire before retreating. Guzman ordered the city burned to deny the buccaneers any plunder. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Some fires were likely set by retreating Spanish forces. Some were likely set by buccaneers. In the chaos of a city under assault, fires spread quickly. What's certain is that Panama City was destroyed. Thousands of buildings burned. The cathedral, a beautiful stone structure that had stood for nearly a century, was reduced to ruins. Hundreds of people died. Some burned in the fires, some were killed by buccaneers, some died of disease or starvation in the aftermath. Morgan's men stayed in the ruins for nearly a month. They searched through the rubble for treasure. They found less than they'd hoped. Much of Panama City's wealth had been evacuated before the battle. Ships had carried gold, silver, and valuable goods across the Pacific to safer ports. The buccaneers captured about 600 prisoners. Morgan held them for ransom. He sent messages to surviving Spanish officials demanding payment for each prisoner's release. Some ransoms were paid, many weren't. The Spanish officials who might have paid had fled or were dead. When the buccaneers finally marched back to the Caribbean coast, they carried with them whatever loot they'd managed to find. Silver and gold, of course, but also silks, jewels, church vestments, even furniture. They also drove hundreds of mules and horses loaded with plunder. Back on the Caribbean coast, Morgan divided the spoils. The total take was disappointing. After nearly 2,000 men split the loot, each buccaneer received about 200 pieces of eight. This was a decent sum, equivalent to several months' wages, but many buccaneers had expected to become wealthy. They'd endured 9 days of hell marching across the isthmus. They'd fought a battle. They'd searched through the ruins of a city. And this was all they got. Rumors spread that Morgan had kept treasure for himself. Some claimed he'd hidden barrels of gold before the division. Others said he'd made secret deals with wealthy Spanish prisoners, taking bribes in exchange for their release. Morgan denied everything. He insisted the division had been fair. There simply hadn't been as much treasure as everyone expected. Whether Morgan was telling the truth is still debated. What's certain is that he returned to Jamaica with more wealth than most of his men. He expected to be celebrated. Instead, he was arrested. While Morgan was sacking Panama, the political situation in Europe had changed. In 1670 AD, England and Spain had signed the Treaty of Madrid. The treaty promised peace between the two nations in the Caribbean. Both sides agreed to stop attacking each other's colonies and ships. News of the treaty reached Jamaica before Morgan launched his raid on Panama. Governor Modiford received a copy of the treaty in late 1670 AD. He should have recalled Morgan immediately. But Modiford hesitated. Morgan's fleet had already sailed. Sending a ship to catch up with him would be difficult. And besides, Modiford reasoned, the Spanish had been attacking English settlements even after the treaty was signed. So Modiford did nothing. When news of the sack of Panama reached Europe, Spain was furious. The Spanish ambassador in London, Pedro Ronquillo, demanded that England punish those responsible. He called Morgan a pirate and a criminal. He demanded that Morgan be hanged. King Charles II of England found himself in a difficult position. On one hand, Morgan had violated a treaty. On the other hand, Morgan was English, and hanging him would look like giving in to Spanish demands. Charles decided to make a show of punishing Morgan without actually punishing him very much. In 1672 AD, both Governor Modiford and Henry Morgan were recalled to England. Modiford was arrested and briefly imprisoned in the Tower of London. He was never tried. After 2 years, he was released. Morgan was also arrested. He spent several months in England, technically under house arrest, but he was never imprisoned. He was never tried. Instead, Morgan became a celebrity. Londoners saw him as a hero, a bold English adventurer who'd defeated the Spanish. Pamphlets about his exploits sold well. Exquemelin's book, The Buccaneers of America, had been published and was widely read. Morgan cultivated his image. He commissioned a portrait of himself dressed in fine clothes. He socialized with London society. He even met with King Charles. In 1674 AD, Charles knighted Morgan, Sir Henry Morgan. The buccaneer who'd sacked Panama was now a knight of the realm. Charles also appointed Morgan to be Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica. This was a brilliant political move. It showed Spain that England wasn't going to hang Morgan, but it also sent a message to English colonists in the Caribbean. The era of buccaneer raids was over. Morgan returned to Jamaica in 1675 AD. His job was to suppress piracy. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Morgan, the most successful buccaneer in Caribbean history, was now responsible for hunting down pirates. And he did his job. Morgan hanged pirates. He confiscated ships. He issued proclamations against piracy. Some of the men he hanged were former comrades, buccaneers he'd sailed with. Morgan didn't hesitate. He understood that times had changed. England wanted stability in the Caribbean. Piracy disrupted trade. Trade made money. Morgan grew wealthy as lieutenant governor. He bought plantations. He owned slaves, hundreds of them. He became one of the richest men in Jamaica. He also drank heavily. By the late 1670s AD, Morgan's health was declining. He suffered from dropsy, an accumulation of fluid in the body, probably caused by liver disease. His legs swelled. He had difficulty breathing. In 1688 AD, Henry Morgan died at his plantation in Jamaica. He was about 53 years old. Morgan was given a state funeral. Cannons fired salutes. Flags flew at half-mast. He was buried in the Palisadoes Cemetery in Port Royal. 4 years later, in 1692 AD, a massive earthquake struck Jamaica. Port Royal, the wickedest city on earth, sank into the sea. 2/3 of the city disappeared beneath the waves. About 2,000 people died. The Palisadoes Cemetery slid into the ocean. Henry Morgan's grave was lost. To some, it seemed like divine judgment, God's punishment for a city built on piracy and sin. To others, it was just geology, the unfortunate location of a city on unstable sand. Either way, the destruction of Port Royal marked the end of an era. The age of the buccaneers was over, but Caribbean piracy wasn't finished. It was about to enter its golden age. By the 1690s AD, the Caribbean had changed. The old buccaneer havens were gone. Tortuga was now a French colonial outpost. Port Royal lay beneath the sea. European powers had established firm control over their Caribbean colonies. France, England, Spain, and the Netherlands all had profitable sugar plantations. These plantations relied on enslaved African labor. The transatlantic slave trade had grown into a massive industry. Ships crisscrossed the Atlantic constantly, from Europe to Africa, carrying manufactured goods, textiles, weapons, rum. From Africa to the Caribbean, carrying enslaved people. From the Caribbean to Europe, carrying sugar, tobacco, cotton, and indigo. This triangular trade route generated enormous wealth. It also created opportunities for piracy. The late 1600s AD and early 1700s AD saw almost constant warfare in Europe. The 9 Years' War lasted from 1688 AD to 1697 AD. The War of Spanish Succession lasted from 1701 AD to 1714 AD. These European wars spilled over into the Caribbean. When England fought France in Europe, English and French colonists fought in the Caribbean. Both sides issued letters of marque to privateers. Privateering offered legal cover for what was essentially piracy. A privateer captain could attack enemy ships, capture their cargo, and sell it for profit. As long as he held a letter of marque, he wasn't a criminal. He was a patriot. Thousands of men joined privateer crews during these wars. The pay was better than merchant or naval service. The work was dangerous but potentially lucrative. A lucky capture could make a sailor wealthy. Then, in 1714 AD, the War of Spanish Succession ended. Suddenly, tens of thousands of sailors were out of work. Naval ships were decommissioned. Privateers lost their letters of marque. Sailors who'd spent years fighting at sea found themselves unemployed. Many had no homes to return to. They'd been at sea since they were boys. They had no families, no land, no savings. Merchant ships offered employment, but conditions were terrible. Merchant sailors worked long hours for low pay. Captains ruled with absolute authority. Flogging was common for even minor infractions. Food was bad: salt pork, hardtack, water that turned foul after weeks at sea. Disease was rampant: scurvy, dysentery, typhus. A merchant sailor might earn £2 or £3 per month, barely enough to survive. Compare that to pirate life. On a pirate ship, the crew elected the captain. Major decisions were made by vote. Plunder was divided fairly. A single successful raid could bring a pirate more money than a merchant sailor earned in a year. The choice wasn't hard to understand. In 1716 AD, a former privateer named Benjamin Hornigold established a base on the island of New Providence in the Bahamas. New Providence had a natural harbour at Nassau. The island was technically a British colony, but it had been abandoned by its colonial government. A hurricane had destroyed most of the settlements in 1703 AD. The few British officials who remained had fled. Nassau was empty. Hornigold and other pirates moved in. Within a year, Nassau had become a pirate republic. More than 1,000 pirates lived on New Providence. They built crude shelters along the beach. They established taverns and brothels. They had no formal government. Instead, they operated under a rough form of democracy. Disputes were settled by vote or by duel. The most respected captains, men like Hornigold, Charles Vane, and Edward Teach, held influence, but no one had absolute authority. Nassau became the capital of Caribbean piracy. Pirate ships sailed from Nassau to hunt merchant vessels. They ranged across the Caribbean and up the American coast. They captured ships carrying sugar, tobacco, slaves, and manufactured goods. They brought their plunder back to Nassau. Merchants, many of them perfectly legal businessmen from Charleston, New York, and Boston, came to Nassau to buy stolen goods at discount prices. The economy of Nassau ran on piracy. Among the pirates who made Nassau their home was Edward Teach. History would remember him by another name: Blackbeard. Edward Teach was born sometime around 1680 AD, probably in Bristol, England. Bristol was a major port city, heavily involved in transatlantic trade. Many Bristol ships participated in the slave trade. Teach probably went to sea as a teenager. He may have served on merchant ships or privateers during the War of Spanish Succession. By the time the war ended, he was an experienced sailor. In 1716 AD, Teach joined Benjamin Hornigold's crew in Nassau. Hornigold recognized Teach's abilities. He gave Teach command of a captured sloop. For about a year, Teach and Hornigold sailed together, raiding merchant ships in the Caribbean. Then, in late 1717 AD, they captured a French slave ship called La Concorde. La Concorde was a large vessel, about 100 feet long. It had been built as a cargo ship, but had been fitted with cannons. It could carry a crew of over 100 men. Teach took the ship for himself. He renamed it Queen Anne's Revenge, a reference to Queen Anne of England, who had recently died. Teach added more cannons to the ship, bringing the total to about 40. He assembled a crew of around 300 men, and he began cultivating a terrifying image. Teach was a large man, over 6 feet tall, unusual for the time. He had a thick black beard that covered most of his face and chest. He braided the beard and tied it with ribbons. Before going into battle, Teach would tie slow-burning fuses, cords soaked in saltpeter, into his beard and under his hat. He'd light the fuses. They would burn slowly, producing thick smoke and sparks that wreathed his head. Combined with his size, his wild appearance, and his fearsome reputation, the effect was demonic. One contemporary account described him as looking like a figure from hell itself. The image was deliberate. Teach understood psychology. If merchant captains believed he was a bloodthirsty monster, they'd surrender without a fight. And it worked. Blackbeard's reputation spread quickly along the American coast and throughout the Caribbean. Merchant captains who spotted Queen Anne's Revenge approaching would often strike their colors immediately. Blackbeard rarely had to actually fight. In fact, there are no confirmed accounts of Blackbeard killing anyone during his piracy career, except in his final battle. This wasn't because Blackbeard was merciful, it was because his reputation did the work for him. If a ship surrendered immediately, Blackbeard usually treated the crew well. He'd take their cargo and sometimes their ship, then let them go. He might even give them a smaller vessel so they could reach port. This pragmatic approach served Blackbeard well. Word spread that surrendering to Blackbeard was safe. Resisting him, on the other hand, was rumored to be fatal. Whether this was true didn't matter. The rumor was enough. In May 1718 AD, Blackbeard demonstrated his power by blockading Charleston, South Carolina. Charleston was one of the most important ports in the American colonies. It was a center for the trade in rice, indigo, and enslaved people. Blackbeard sailed Queen Anne's Revenge and 3 smaller ships into Charleston Harbor. For nearly a week, he stopped every ship trying to enter or leave. He captured at least 8 vessels. He took passengers hostage, including several prominent citizens. Among the hostages was Samuel Wragg, a member of the South Carolina Provincial Council. Blackbeard sent a message to the governor. His demand was unusual. He didn't ask for gold or silver. He asked for a chest of medicine. If the governor sent the medicine, Blackbeard would release the hostages unharmed. If not, he promised to send the hostages' heads to the governor in a sack and burn every captured ship. The governor complied. A chest of medicine was delivered to Blackbeard's ships. Blackbeard released all the hostages. He sailed away. Why did Blackbeard demand medicine instead of treasure? His crew was likely suffering from disease. Some historians believe they had syphilis, which was common among sailors. Others think they had malaria or yellow fever. The medicine chest probably contained mercury compounds used to treat syphilis, along with quinine for fever and other remedies. To Blackbeard's crew, these medicines were more valuable than gold. After leaving Charleston, Blackbeard sailed north to North Carolina. There, something strange happened. Blackbeard ran Queen Anne's Revenge aground near Beaufort Inlet. The ship became stuck on a sandbar and couldn't be freed. Some historians believe this was an accident. Others think Blackbeard did it deliberately. If it was deliberate, the reason might have been practical. Queen Anne's Revenge required a large crew, 300 men. That meant dividing plunder 300 ways. By wrecking the ship, Blackbeard could reduce the size of his crew. He transferred to a smaller sloop called Adventure. He took about 40 men with him, his most trusted followers. The rest of the crew was left stranded on a sandbar. Whether intentional or not, the result was that Blackbeard now had a smaller, more manageable crew. And each man's share of any future plunder would be larger. Blackbeard then approached Charles Eden, the governor of North Carolina. In 1718 AD, King George I of England had issued a royal proclamation offering pardons to pirates. Any pirate who surrendered before a certain date would be forgiven for his crimes. The idea was to encourage pirates to retire. Blackbeard applied for a pardon. Governor Eden granted it. For several months, Blackbeard lived quietly near Bath, North Carolina. He rented a house. He even married a local woman, reportedly his 14th wife, though this number is probably exaggerated. But retirement didn't suit Blackbeard. By the fall of 1718 AD, he was back to piracy. He attacked ships along the North Carolina coast. Rumors spread that Governor Eden was protecting Blackbeard. Some claimed Eden was receiving a share of Blackbeard's plunder. These rumors may have been true. Eden was a relatively poor governor of a relatively poor colony. A cut of pirate treasure would have been tempting. But whether or not Eden was corrupt, someone else decided to act. Alexander Spotswood was the governor of Virginia, the colony just north of North Carolina. Spotswood had no love for pirates. He also had no love for Governor Eden. Spotswood decided to eliminate Blackbeard. He commissioned a Royal Navy officer, Lieutenant Robert Maynard, to hunt down the pirate. Maynard was given 2 sloops, HMS Ranger and HMS Jane, About 60 men volunteered for the mission. Maynard's sloops had no cannons. They'd been removed to make the ships faster and more maneuverable in shallow coastal waters. On November 21st, 1718 AD, Maynard found Blackbeard. Blackbeard's sloop Adventure was anchored in Ocracoke Inlet, a narrow waterway on the North Carolina coast. The battle began at dawn. Blackbeard's crew spotted Maynard's ships approaching. Blackbeard ordered his men to prepare for battle. He lit the fuses in his beard. As Maynard's sloops drew closer, Blackbeard fired a broadside. Adventure had 8 cannons. Maynard's ships had none. The broadside was devastating. Cannonballs and grape shot, small iron balls packed into canvas bags, tore through the Ranger. The ship's commander was killed. More than 20 men were wounded. But Maynard pressed on in the Jane. He ordered most of his men to hide below deck. Only a handful remained visible. Blackbeard, seeing what appeared to be a nearly empty ship, decided to board. This was a fatal mistake. Blackbeard and about a dozen of his crew climbed onto the Jane. As soon as they were aboard, Maynard's hidden men rushed up from below deck. A brutal fight erupted. Men fought with cutlasses, pistols, and boarding axes. The deck became slippery with blood. Blackbeard and Lieutenant Maynard confronted each other. Both men drew pistols. Both fired. Both missed. They drew their swords. Blackbeard swung his cutlass at Maynard's head. Maynard raised his sword to block. Blackbeard's cutlass was heavier. It shattered Maynard's blade. Maynard stumbled backward. Blackbeard raised his cutlass for a killing blow. Before he could strike, one of Maynard's men, a sailor whose name is recorded only as a Highlander, slashed Blackbeard across the neck with a sword. The wound was deep. Blood poured down Blackbeard's chest. But Blackbeard didn't fall. He fought on. Other sailors surrounded him. They stabbed him repeatedly. They shot him. According to Maynard's official report, Blackbeard suffered 5 gunshot wounds and more than 20 cuts before he finally collapsed. He died on the deck of the Jane. Maynard ordered Blackbeard's head cut off. He hung it from the bowsprit of his sloop, a gruesome trophy. He threw Blackbeard's body overboard. Legend says the body swam 3 times around the ship before sinking. This is almost certainly not true, but it's the kind of story people wanted to believe about Blackbeard. Maynard sailed back to Virginia with Blackbeard's head. Governor Spotswood had the head mounted on a pike at the entrance to the Hampton River. It remained there for years as a warning to other pirates. Blackbeard's pirate career had lasted less than 2 years. But in that time, he'd become the most famous pirate in the world. In October 1720 AD, a pirate ship called the William sailed along the coast of Jamaica. Its captain was John Rackham, Calico Jack. Among his crew were 2 people who would become legendary: Bonny and Mary Read. Most Caribbean pirates were men. Women who wanted to go to sea usually had to disguise themselves. Many pirate articles explicitly forbade women on board. The reasoning was practical rather than moral. Pirates believed that having women aboard would cause jealousy and fighting. Crew cohesion was essential on a pirate ship. Anything that threatened that cohesion was dangerous. But some women became pirates anyway. Bonny was born in Ireland around 1697 AD. Her father, William Cormac, was a lawyer. Her mother, Mary Brennan, was a servant in Cormac's household. The affair was scandalous. Cormac's wife found out about his relationship with Mary Brennan. Cormac's legal practice suffered. His reputation was ruined. Cormac decided to start fresh in the new world. He moved to Charleston, South Carolina, taking Mary Brennan and their daughter Anne with him. In Charleston, Cormac established himself as a merchant and plantation owner. He became wealthy. Anne grew up in relative comfort. But Anne had a reputation for wildness. Contemporary accounts describe her as having a fierce temper. One story claims she once stabbed a servant girl with a table knife during an argument. Another says she beat a would-be suitor so badly he spent weeks recovering. These stories may be exaggerated, but they suggest Anne didn't conform to expectations for women of her time. As a teenager, Anne married a sailor named James Bonny. Her father was furious. He'd hoped Anne would marry someone wealthy and respectable. Instead, she'd married a poor sailor. Cormac disinherited her. Anne and James Bonny left Charleston. They moved to Nassau in the Bahamas. Nassau, in 1718 AD, was the pirate republic. James Bonny found work as an informant for the new governor, Woodes Rogers. Rogers had been appointed to clean up Nassau and suppress piracy. James Bonny helped him by reporting on pirate activities. Anne was disgusted. She'd come to Nassau expecting adventure. Instead, her husband had become a traitor to the pirate community. Anne left him. She began a relationship with John Rackham, Calico Jack. Rackham was a pirate captain. He'd earned his nickname from his habit of wearing brightly colored calico cloth. He wasn't particularly successful as a pirate. His captures were modest, small merchant vessels, fishing boats, but he was charismatic. Rackham and Anne left Nassau together in 1719 AD. They stole a sloop and assembled a small crew. Anne joined the crew. Some accounts say she disguised herself as a man. Others say the crew knew she was a woman, but didn't care. Mary Red had a very different path to piracy. She was born in England around 1690 AD. Her mother had been married to a sailor who'd gone to sea and never returned. While he was gone, Mary's mother had a son. The boy died in infancy. Then Mary was born, the daughter of a different father. Mary's mother faced a problem. She'd been receiving financial support from her late son's grandmother. If the grandmother learned the boy had died, the money would stop. So Mary's mother dressed Mary as a boy and passed her off as her older brother. Mary grew up living as a male. As a teenager, she continued the deception. She joined the British military, serving as a soldier in Flanders during the War of Spanish Succession. Mary fought bravely. No one suspected she was a woman. At some point, Mary revealed her identity to a fellow soldier. They fell in love. They left the military and married. They opened an inn called the Three Horseshoes, somewhere in the Netherlands. For a while, Mary had a conventional life. Then her husband died suddenly. The inn failed. Mary was left alone and penniless. She disguised herself as a man again and returned to military life. But with the war over, there were few opportunities. Mary decided to seek her fortune in the Caribbean. She joined a merchant ship bound for the West Indies. During the voyage, the ship was captured by pirates. Mary joined the pirate crew. She had little choice. Captured merchant sailors were often forced to join pirate crews, but Mary may have joined willingly. Piracy offered adventure and profit. Eventually, Mary ended up on Calico Jack Rackham's ship. There, she met Anne Bonny. According to one version of events, Anne was attracted to Mary, still believing Mary was a man. Calico Jack became jealous. To resolve the situation, Mary revealed she was a woman. Anne and Mary became close friends. Together, they served on Rackham's crew. Contemporary accounts describe both women as fierce fighters. They dressed in men's clothing during battles, loose shirts, trousers, headscarves. They wielded cutlasses and pistols as capably as any man. Dorothy Thomas, a woman whose ship was captured by Rackham's crew, later testified that she'd seen both Anne Bonny and Mary Read on deck during the attack. Thomas said the two women wore men's jackets and trousers. She said each had a machete and pistol. She said they cursed and swore like the male pirates. In October 1720 AD, Governor Woodes Rogers of the Bahamas commissioned a pirate hunter named Jonathan Barnett to track down Rackham's crew. Barnett commanded an armed sloop. On the night of October 22nd, Barnett found Rackham's ship anchored off the coast of Jamaica. Rackham and most of his crew were drunk. They'd captured a fishing vessel earlier that day and were celebrating with rum. When Barnett attacked, Rackham and most of the male crew fled below deck. Anne Bonny and Mary Read stayed on deck. They fought alone. According to trial testimony, Anne shouted at the men hiding below to come up and fight like men. When they refused, She fired her pistol down into the hold. She wounded one of her own crewmates. But 2 women couldn't hold off Barnett's entire crew. Barnett's men boarded the ship and overpowered them. Rackham, Anne Bonny, Mary Read, and the rest of the crew were captured. They were taken to Spanish Town, Jamaica, and put on trial. The trial took place in November 1720 AD. Rackham and the male crew members were quickly found guilty of piracy. They were sentenced to hang. Anne Bonny and Mary Read were also found guilty. But when the judge asked if they had anything to say before sentencing, both women made the same declaration. They were pregnant. Under English law at the time, pregnant women could not be executed. The court would wait until after they gave birth to carry out the sentence. This rule existed to protect the unborn child, who was considered innocent. Calico Jack Rackham was hanged on November 18, 1720 AD. Before his execution, Anne Bonny was allowed to visit him in his cell. According to witnesses, Anne told Rackham she was sorry to see him there, but, she added, if he'd fought like a man, he wouldn't be about to hang like a dog. This was Anne's last recorded statement. Mary Read died in prison in April 1721 AD. The cause of death was likely fever, probably yellow fever or malaria. Whether she was actually pregnant or whether this had been a ploy to delay execution is unknown. Anne Bonny's fate is a mystery. There's no record of her execution. There's no record of her death in prison. She simply disappears from the historical record after 1721 AD. Some historians believe her wealthy father paid for her release. William Cormac had disowned Anne when she married James Bonny, but perhaps he relented when he learned she was facing execution. One legend claims Anne returned to Charleston, remarried under a false name, and lived into old age. Church records in Charleston show a woman named Anne Burley died in 1782 AD. Some researchers believe this may have been Anne Bonny, but we'll never know for sure. What we do know is that Anne Bonny and Mary Read became legends. Their stories appeared in A General History of the Pirates, published in 1724 AD. The book portrayed them as exceptional, women who'd defied convention and lived as outlaws. They weren't the only women pirates. There were others, though records are sparse. Most women who went to sea as pirates disguised themselves and were never discovered. Anne Bonny and Mary Read are remembered because they were caught, and because they chose to fight rather than hide. What was it actually like to live on a pirate ship? Most pirate ships were small. A typical pirate vessel was a sloop, a single-masted ship about 60 to 70 feet long. A sloop could carry a crew of 50 to 80 men. Sloops were fast and maneuverable. They could sail in shallow water where larger ships couldn't follow. They were perfect for chasing down merchant vessels or escaping from naval warships. Some pirates used larger ships. Brigantines had 2 masts and could carry 100 men. 3-masted ships like Blackbeard's Queen Anne's Revenge were rare. They required larger crews and more resources to maintain. Space on any pirate ship was extremely limited. There were no private cabins for ordinary sailors. Men slept wherever they could find room. Some slept on deck, exposed to sun, rain, and spray. Some slept in the hold, among barrels of supplies and coils of rope. Some strung hammocks between beams below deck. The captain usually had a small cabin at the stern of the ship. But even this was cramped. A captain's cabin on a sloop might be 6 feet by 8 feet, barely large enough for a bed, a desk, and a chest. Hygiene was minimal. Most ships had no latrines. Men relieved themselves by hanging over the side of the ship or using a bucket. Bathing was rare. Fresh water was too precious to waste on washing. Sailors might bathe in seawater, but salt water doesn't clean well. Pirates stank. They smelled of sweat, tar, gunpowder, and rotting food. Their clothes were filthy and crawling with lice. Food on pirate ships was monotonous and often disgusting. The basic diet consisted of salted meat, hardtack, and dried peas or beans. Salted meat, usually pork or beef, was preserved by packing it in barrels with salt. After months at sea, this meat became hard and unpalatable. Sailors had to soak it in water for hours before cooking to remove some of the salt. Hardtack was a type of dry biscuit made from flour, water, and salt. It was baked until completely dry so it wouldn't spoil. Hardtack was hard, so hard it could break teeth. Sailors often had to soak it in water or rum to make it edible. Hardtack also became infested with weevils, small beetles that laid eggs in the flour. When sailors broke open a piece of hardtack, they'd often find it full of insect larvae. Experienced sailors would tap the hardtack on the table first to knock out the weevils. Fresh food was a luxury. Pirates would raid coastal towns or fishing boats for fresh meat, fruit, and vegetables. They'd capture chickens, pigs, or goats and keep them alive on board until they were needed for food. But fresh food spoiled quickly in the Caribbean heat. Fruit rotted within days. Meat turned foul. Pirates ate well only immediately after a raid. Drinking water was a constant problem. Fresh water was stored in wooden barrels. Within weeks, the water would turn brackish and develop a foul taste. Algae grew in the barrels. The water became slimy. Pirates preferred rum or beer. Alcohol helped preserve the liquid. It also made bad water more palatable, and it provided calories. Pirates drank heavily. When they captured a ship carrying rum or wine, they'd often drink themselves into a stupor. This sometimes led to disaster. Drunken crews were vulnerable to attack. Disease was the greatest killer on pirate ships. Scurvy was common. Scurvy is caused by a lack of vitamin C. Without fresh fruit or vegetables, sailors developed the disease within months. Early symptoms included fatigue and joint pain. Then gums would begin to bleed and swell. Teeth would loosen and fall out. Old wounds would reopen. Bruises would appear all over the body. In advanced stages, scurvy was fatal. Dysentery and typhoid fever were also widespread. These diseases spread through contaminated water and poor sanitation. They caused severe diarrhea, fever, and dehydration. Many pirates died from these illnesses. Yellow fever and malaria were endemic in the Caribbean. Yellow fever caused high fever, jaundice, and internal bleeding. It killed quickly, within a week of symptoms appearing. Malaria caused recurring fevers and chills. It weakened victims over time. Both diseases were transmitted by mosquitoes, but pirates didn't know this. They had no way to prevent or treat these diseases effectively. Injuries were frequent. Pirates fought with cutlasses, pistols, and muskets. Sword wounds, gunshot wounds, and broken bones were common. Most pirate ships didn't have trained surgeons. Medical care was primitive. Wounds were cleaned with seawater or rum. They were bandaged with whatever cloth was available. Infection was common. A minor wound could turn gangrenous within days. When gangrene set in, amputation was often the only option. Amputations were performed by whoever had the steadiest hand, often the ship's carpenter. The patient was given rum to dull the pain. The limb was cut off with a saw. The wound was cauterized with a hot iron or boiling tar to stop the bleeding. Many men died from the shock or from infection afterward. Despite these hardships, pirate life had appeal. On a pirate ship, a man had a voice. He could vote on major decisions. He shared equally, or nearly equally, in the plunder. He wasn't subject to the arbitrary authority of officers. Pirates operated under codes, sets of rules that governed behavior on board. These codes were called articles. Before a voyage, the crew would agree on a set of articles. Every man would sign or make his mark on the document. The articles varied from ship to ship, but most included similar provisions. One famous set of articles belonged to Captain Bartholomew Roberts. Roberts was one of the most successful pirates of the Golden Age. He captured more than 400 ships in his career. Roberts' articles included 11 rules. First, every man had a vote in affairs of moment. He had equal title to fresh provisions or strong liquors seized from captured ships. He could use them at pleasure unless scarcity made it necessary to vote a retrenchment. This meant every pirate had equal access to food and drink, unless supplies were so low that rationing was necessary. Second, every man was to be called fairly in turn by the list on board of prizes. When plunder was divided, men took turns choosing items. Over and above their proper share, each man was allowed a shift of clothes. Third, no person was to game at cards or dice for money. Gambling was forbidden to prevent fights. Fourth, lights and candles were to be put out at 8 o'clock at night. If any man wished to drink after that hour, he had to remain on the open deck. This rule prevented fires and encouraged men to get adequate sleep. Fifth, every man was to keep his piece, pistols and cutlass clean and fit for service. Weapons had to be maintained and ready for action. Sixth, no boy or woman was to be allowed among the crew. If any man seduced a woman and carried her to sea disguised, he was to suffer death. This was the rule Anne Bonny and Mary Read violated. Seventh, any man who deserted the ship or his quarters in battle was to be punished with death or marooning. Cowardice was not tolerated. Eighth, no man was to strike another on board the ship. Every man's quarrels were to be ended on shore by sword or pistol. Fighting was forbidden on board to maintain discipline, but men were allowed to settle disputes through duels on land. Ninth, no man was to talk of breaking up their way of living until each man had shared £1,000. Pirates couldn't retire until the crew had accumulated a certain amount of wealth. 10th, the captain and quartermaster each received 2 shares of a prize. The master, boatswain, and gunner received 1.5 shares. Other officers received 1.25 shares. Common sailors received 1 share each. This was far more egalitarian than merchant or naval ships. 11th, musicians were allowed to rest on Sundays. On other days, they could rest only by favor. This humorous rule acknowledged that musicians worked constantly, playing to entertain the crew and to coordinate work. Roberts' articles also included compensation for injuries. Loss of a right arm, 600 pieces of 8 or 6 slaves. Loss of a left arm, 500 pieces of 8 or 5 slaves. Loss of a right leg, 500 pieces of 8 or 5 slaves. Loss of a left leg, 400 pieces of 8 or 4 slaves. Loss of an eye or finger, 100 pieces of 8 or 1 slave. These payments came out of the common fund before plunder was divided. This insurance system encouraged men to fight bravely. They knew that if they were maimed, they wouldn't be left destitute. Pirate ships were, in their way, small democracies. Captains were elected by the crew. If the crew lost confidence in a captain, they could vote him out. This happened regularly. Charles Vane, a notorious pirate, was voted out as captain after he refused to attack a French warship. His crew accused him of cowardice. They elected a new captain and set Vane adrift in a small boat with a handful of loyal men. The quartermaster was the second most important position on a pirate ship. The quartermaster was also elected by the crew. His job was to represent the crew's interests. The quartermaster distributed provisions. He settled disputes between crew members. He led boarding parties during attacks. He divided plunder. The quartermaster acted as a check on the captain's power. If the captain tried to take more than his share, the quartermaster could object. If the captain abused crew members, the quartermaster could call for a vote to remove him. This system wasn't perfect. During battle, the captain had absolute authority. Men who disobeyed orders during a fight could be shot on the spot. And pirate democracy had clear limits. It applied only to members of the crew. Captives had no rights. Enslaved people carried on captured ships were usually sold rather than freed. Pirate ships weren't utopias. They were brutal, violent places. But within their own ranks, pirates had created something unusual. A society where men had some control over their own lives. By the early 1720s, AD, Caribbean piracy was dying. European navies had grown stronger and more organized. Colonial governments had become more effective at enforcing the law, and the economic conditions that had fueled piracy were changing. The royal pardon of 1718 AD had some effect. King George I offered amnesty to any pirate who surrendered before September 5, 1718 AD. Hundreds of pirates accepted. Some retired permanently. They took their savings and settled in colonies as farmers or merchants. Others, like Blackbeard, returned to piracy after a brief retirement. But the window for piracy was closing. In 1718 AD, the British government appointed Woodes Rogers as governor of the Bahamas. Rogers had been a privateer himself during the War of Spanish Succession. He'd led a successful circumnavigation of the globe. He understood how pirates operated. Rogers' mission was to clean up Nassau and suppress piracy. He arrived in Nassau with a fleet of warships and several hundred soldiers. Many pirates fled before he arrived. Others accepted his offer of pardons. A few resisted. Charles Vane, one of the most violent pirates in Nassau, fired on Rogers' ships as they entered the harbour. Then he escaped under cover of darkness. Rogers spent the next several years hunting down the remaining pirates. He executed those he captured. He fortified Nassau and established a functioning colonial government. Other Caribbean governors followed Rogers' example. They offered rewards for the capture of pirates. They commissioned privateers, legal pirates, to hunt down illegal ones. They fortified ports and trained militias. The Royal Navy began dedicating ships specifically to anti-piracy patrols. These ships were fast and well armed. They were commanded by experienced officers who knew Caribbean waters. One by one, the famous pirates were captured or killed. Blackbeard died in 1718 AD. Calico Jack was hanged in 1720 AD. Charles Vane was captured in 1720 AD and hanged in 1721 AD. Bartholomew Roberts, Black Bart, was one of the last great pirate captains. Roberts had been a merchant sailor before turning to piracy. In 1719 AD, his ship was captured by pirates. Roberts joined the pirate crew. 6 weeks later, the pirate captain was killed in an attack. The crew elected Roberts as the new captain. Roberts proved to be extraordinarily successful. Over the next 3 years, he captured more than 400 ships. He raided ports from Brazil to Newfoundland. He captured slave ships, merchant vessels, and even a treasure fleet. Roberts was meticulous and strategic. He kept detailed records of his captures. He enforced his articles strictly. He didn't drink alcohol, unusual for a pirate. Roberts was also ruthless. He hated the governors of Barbados and Martinique, both of whom had tried to capture him. He flew a black flag showing himself standing on 2 skulls labelled ABH and AMH, a Barbadian's head and a Martinican's head. But Roberts's luck ran out in February 1722 AD. A Royal Navy ship called HMS Swallow, commanded by Captain Challoner Ogle, caught up with Roberts off the coast of West Africa. Roberts' crew was unprepared. They'd captured a slave ship the day before and had been drinking all night to celebrate. When the Swallow appeared, many of Roberts' men were too drunk to fight. Roberts himself dressed for battle in his finest clothes. He wore a crimson damask waistcoat and breeches, a red feather in his hat, and a gold chain with a large diamond-studded cross around his neck. The Swallow opened fire. A piece of grape shot struck Roberts in the throat. He died instantly. Roberts' crew was devastated. According to his final wishes, they threw his body overboard while he was still dressed in his finery. They didn't want the Royal Navy to capture his body and display it as a trophy. Without Roberts, the crew had no will to fight. They surrendered. The captured pirates were taken to Cape Coast Castle in present-day Ghana for trial. It was the largest piracy trial in history. Over 200 men were tried. 52 were hanged. 2 were gibbeted, hanged in iron cages and left to rot as a warning. 37 were sentenced to hard labor in Africa. The rest were acquitted or died in prison before trial. Bartholomew Roberts' death marked the end of the Golden Age of Piracy. After 1722 AD, large-scale piracy in the Caribbean declined sharply. There were still pirates, of course. Small-scale piracy continued for decades. But the era of famous pirate captains commanding fleets and challenging empires was over. Why did piracy decline so quickly? Part of the answer is enforcement. Governments invested significant resources in hunting down pirates. They executed captured pirates publicly to deter others. They fortified ports and established naval patrols. But enforcement alone doesn't explain the decline. The deeper reason is economic. By the 1730s AD, the Caribbean economy had stabilized. Sugar plantations were profitable and well established. Trade routes were more secure. Merchant shipping expanded. This meant more jobs for sailors. Men who might have turned to piracy in the 1710s AD could now find legal work. The work was still hard. Merchant captains were still harsh. Pay was still low. But it was legal work, and being a merchant sailor, however miserable, was safer than being a pirate. There's also a darker side to the story. The decline of piracy coincided with the expansion of slavery. Caribbean plantations relied on enslaved African labor. The transatlantic slave trade reached its peak in the 18th century. European governments prioritized protecting this system. Piracy disrupted trade, including the slave trade. Pirates captured slave ships, either freeing or selling the enslaved people aboard. This was intolerable to colonial powers, whose wealth depended on plantation slavery. So they crushed piracy. The pirates of the Golden Age had been, in some ways, disruptive to the emerging system of racial capitalism in the Caribbean. Not because they opposed slavery, many pirates were slaveholders or slave traders themselves, but because they disrupted the orderly flow of trade that the system required. Once governments had the resources and the will to suppress piracy, they did so ruthlessly. A man stands on a gallows in Port Royal, Jamaica. We return now to where we began. November 1720. AD. Calico. Jack Rackham waiting to die. The crowd below has fallen silent. The executioner adjusts the noose one final time. Rackham looks out at the harbour. The ships are still there, bobbing gently in the blue water. The sails are still furled. The world continues, indifferent to his death. What did Rackham's life mean? He was a minor figure in the grand scheme of Caribbean piracy. He captured a few ships. He accumulated some wealth, which he spent quickly. He's remembered mostly because of the women in his crew, Bonny and Mary Read. But Rackham was part of something larger. For a brief moment in history, roughly 70 years, from 1650 AD to 1720 AD, thousands of people chose to live outside the law. They rejected the hierarchies of European empires. They created their own societies on floating wooden platforms. These societies were violent and imperfect. Pirates killed people. They stole. They participated in the slave trade. But they also created something unusual: communities where men elected their leaders, shared resources fairly, and had some control over their own fates. The story of Caribbean piracy is the story of people who refused to accept the world as it was. They were sailors who'd been exploited by merchants and admirals. They were servants who'd worked for years for nothing. They were escaped slaves seeking freedom. They looked at the choices available to them: grinding poverty, brutal labor, early death, and they chose something different. They chose piracy. Was it a good choice? Most pirates died young. They died in battle, or from disease, or on the gallows. Most never became rich. But for a few years, they were free. They sailed where they wanted. They answered to no master. They lived by their own rules. The legacy of Caribbean piracy lives on in unexpected ways. The Jolly Roger, the black flag with skull and crossbones, has become a universal symbol of rebellion. You see it everywhere, on t-shirts, bumper stickers, protest banners. Pirate imagery has been adopted by movements that see themselves as challenging power. Punk rockers in the 1970s, hackers in the digital age, activists and anarchists. All have claimed the pirate as a symbol. Why? Because pirates represent a particular kind of freedom, dangerous freedom, lawless freedom, freedom that comes with a terrible cost. Pirates remind us that people have always resisted systems that exploit them. They remind us that even in the most hierarchical societies, some people will always choose to step outside. The real history of Caribbean piracy is messier than the legends. It's not a simple story of heroes fighting against oppression. It's a story of desperate people making desperate choices. Some of those choices were brave, some were monstrous. Often they were both at once. Calico Jack Rackham takes his last breath. The trapdoor opens beneath him. The rope goes taut. The crowd begins to disperse. There will be other executions tomorrow, other pirates to hang. But the great age of Caribbean piracy is ending. In the harbour, a merchant ship raises its anchor. Its sails catch the wind. It turns toward the open sea. The ship carries sugar from the plantations, sugar produced by enslaved labour, sugar that will make merchants in London wealthy. The ship will cross the Atlantic safely. No pirates will attack it. The Caribbean is becoming orderly. It's becoming profitable. It's becoming safe for empires. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, the Caribbean waits. Warm, blue, endless. The age of pirates has passed, but the sea remains.